The C-130 Hercules was dead on the flight line, until a quiet veteran fixed it alone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. The C-130 Hercules had been sitting on the flight line for hours, its engine silent, its wings still. Crew members, engineers, and even the flight crew had given up. The aircraft was supposed to be airborne by now, but something was wrong, something none of them could figure out. The newest techs scratched their heads, referencing their manuals, running diagnostics, but the readings all came back clean. Nothing was showing up as faulty. The C-130 was dead, but nobody knew why. At first, the crew joked, thinking it was just a temporary glitch. After all, it was a massive aircraft, and things like this happened all the time. But as the hours passed and the sun began to dip lower, frustration mounted. The scheduled flight had to be canceled, and engineers scrambled to try and figure out how to get the giant aircraft off the ground. But the more they checked, the more they found themselves in a loop of confusion. It should be running, one engineer muttered, slamming his laptop shut in frustration. That's when the older man appeared. He was quiet, unassuming, with an old leather tool bag slung over his shoulder. The young techs didn't even notice him at first. He stood to the side, watching them scramble. They were too focused on their work to pay him any attention. The man didn't have a uniform, no patches, no rank. He looked like just another civilian, maybe a contractor or groundskeeper. But there was something about the way he stood, something in the way his eyes never left the aircraft. Finally, one of the younger engineers, a lieutenant named Harris, noticed the man standing off to the side. Harris shot him a quick glance, then turned back to his laptop, shaking his head. "Can we help you, old man?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. The man didn't respond immediately. He just kept his eyes fixed on the C-130, as though assessing it, sizing it up. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and calm. "You're missing something." Harris raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "What's that?" he asked, his voice still sharp. "The fuel line," the man said simply. "You haven't checked the fuel line. You're running around looking at the systems, but you're not looking at the basics." The lieutenant rolled his eyes and turned to the rest of the team. "Seriously? You're telling us to check the fuel line?" His tone was dismissive, as if the man's suggestion was ludicrous. One of the engineers, though, a younger airman named Stevens, glanced at the man and then at the C-130. Something in the old man's calm demeanor struck him as strangely familiar. "Maybe we should check it," Stevens said hesitantly. The others exchanged skeptical glances, but shrugged. They were running out of options. The airman moved toward the fuel line and gently pried open a small hatch. Inside, he found the issue, a tiny, almost invisible blockage that was preventing the fuel from flowing correctly. It was something the newest techs had completely missed. They couldn't believe it. It was such a simple fix, but it had eluded them for hours. They quickly cleared the blockage and returned to their stations. With a flick of the switch, the engine roared to life. The Hercules came alive. It wasn't a major breakdown. It was just a tiny issue that everyone had overlooked. The team stared in awe, still trying to process how they had missed it. As they gathered around, they realized something. They hadn't even asked the man's name. He hadn't introduced himself, hadn't demanded recognition. He had simply stood back and watched. But the truth was clear now. The quiet veteran had known exactly what to do. The Hercules was airborne in no time, and the airmen who had doubted him stood in stunned silence. They had learned an important lesson that day. It wasn't always the latest technology that fixed a problem. Sometimes it was the wisdom of someone who had seen it all before. As the plane ascended into the sky, they couldn't help but wonder. Who was this quiet veteran, and how did he know so much about the C-130? The engines of the C-130 Hercules rumbled to life, the sound filling the flight line with a deep, steady hum. The crew members exchanged looks of disbelief, still processing what had just happened. They had spent hours, all of them trying to diagnose the issue, only for the quiet veteran to come in and fix it with such simplicity. As the massive aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, one of the engineers, Stevens, couldn't shake the feeling that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. He turned to his colleague, a senior airman named Hayes. "Who was that guy?" Stevens asked quietly, not wanting to draw attention. "I don't know," Hayes replied, shaking his head. But whatever he did, he sure knew what he was talking about. The two watched the C-130 disappear down the runway, airborne now, as if it had never been broken in the first place. But there was still the mystery of the quiet veteran who had fixed it so effortlessly. The rest of the crew returned to their posts, but Stevens felt an urge to find out more. "I'm going to ask around," he muttered to Hayes, turning away. The older airman nodded, but didn't say a word. Stevens made his way toward the base's maintenance office, his mind racing. He needed to know who this man was, what his background was, and how he had the knowledge to fix an aircraft that had stumped the entire team. The idea of a veteran showing up out of nowhere and saving the day intrigued him, but it also unsettled him. There was something too calm about the man, something that felt out of place. When Stevens reached the office, he was met with a few familiar faces from the engineering crew. "Hey, you guys ever seen that old guy before?" he asked. One of the techs, a young airman named Jackson, chuckled. "Oh, you mean the guy who just fixed the C-130? Yeah, I saw him hanging around the flight line earlier, but nobody knows who he is. He doesn't have any military ID or anything." Stevens frowned, trying to piece together the puzzle. "You sure he didn't just sneak on base or something?" Jackson shrugged. "Maybe, but there's something about him that feels different." Stevens stood silent for a moment, before shaking his head. "I'm going to find out who he is. Something about him doesn't sit right." As Stevens left the maintenance office, he couldn't help but feel that this was far from over. That quiet veteran had come out of nowhere, but now Stevens was certain that the man knew far more than anyone else at the base realized. Back at the flight line, the C-130 was in the air, soaring high above the clouds. The engineers who had once been baffled by the aircraft's failure stood on the tarmac, still in disbelief. "What just happened?" one of them asked, staring up at the plane. "I don't know," another engineer replied. "But whoever that guy was, he sure saved our asses today." As they stood there, unsure of what to do next, a black SUV pulled up beside them. A well-dressed officer stepped out, wearing a military uniform, his expression stern. "What's going on here?" the officer demanded. The engineers, still shaking their heads in confusion, looked at each other. "The C-130's fixed, sir. It's in the air," one of them explained. The officer raised an eyebrow. "That's good to hear. But who exactly fixed it?" "We're not sure," Stevens said, approaching from behind. There was this older guy, didn't have any ID or anything, but he knew exactly what the problem was. "He just fixed it." The officer stared at Stevens, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you mean, just fixed it?" "He just walked up, pointed out a small issue with the fuel line, and it started up again like nothing was wrong." The officer remained silent for a moment, then turned to the engineers. "Get back to work. I'll handle this." As the officer walked off, Stevens couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That veteran had come out of nowhere, and yet he had just saved the day. And the more Stevens thought about it, the more he realized that he needed to get to the bottom of this. Who was this man? And what was his connection to the military? Later that evening, Stevens sat at a bar near the base, nursing a beer. His mind was still on the mysterious veteran. He couldn't shake the image of the man standing so calmly while the crew panicked. It wasn't until a fellow airman, a young tech named Carter, sat down beside him that he snapped out of his thoughts. "What's up, Stevens?" Carter asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Stevens sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I'm telling you, man, there's something weird about that guy. I've been trying to figure it out all day." Carter raised an eyebrow. "You're seriously still thinking about him?" "It's just an old guy who happened to know what he was doing." "That's the thing," Stevens said, tapping his fingers on the table. "How did he know so much? I mean, he wasn't even supposed to be here. No military ID, nothing. And he walks up, tells us exactly what to do, and fixes the plane in minutes." Carter shrugged. "I don't know, man. Maybe he was just lucky." Stevens shook his head. "No, it's something more. And I'm going to find out what it is." As Stevens left the bar, he felt a growing sense of urgency. This wasn't over. He had to know who that quiet veteran was. Stevens spent the following days trying to piece together the mystery of the quiet veteran. Every time he asked around the base, he was met with dead ends or dismissive shrugs. It seemed as though nobody knew who the man was, or at least, nobody was willing to say anything. The more Stevens thought about it, the more it bothered him. How could a civilian, someone with no clear affiliation, walk in and fix an aircraft that stumped an entire crew of engineers? Something didn't add up. One afternoon, as Stevens was walking through the base's hangar, he saw the officer who had been at the scene when the veteran fixed the C-130. The officer was standing near a group of airmen, his back to Stevens, talking to a few of the crew members. Stevens hesitated for a moment, then walked over, trying to sound casual. "Hey, sir, I wanted to ask you something," Stevens said. The officer turned around, recognizing him immediately. "Stevens, right? What's on your mind?" Stevens hesitated for a second before asking the question that had been on his mind for days. "Who was that guy, the one who fixed the C-130? The officer's expression changed slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for Stevens to notice. "I don't know who he is," the officer said, his voice measured. "I haven't seen him before, but he obviously knows what he's doing. Let's leave it at that." The officer's tone was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Stevens feel uneasy. He could sense that the officer wasn't being entirely open with him. "Sir, you're telling me that nobody knows who he is?" Stevens pressed, his curiosity getting the better of him. The officer looked Stevens up and down, his expression unreadable. "That's right. He showed up, fixed the plane, and left. Simple as that. We've got bigger things to worry about than some old guy fixing a plane." Stevens wasn't convinced, but he knew he wasn't going to get any more information from the officer. "Thanks, sir," he said, turning to walk away. As Stevens walked back through the hangar, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led in circles. Someone knew who that veteran was, but they weren't telling him. He had to find out more, but the question was, how? That night, Stevens couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the quiet veteran and the way he had walked onto the flight line like he owned the place. His mind kept circling back to the small, almost insignificant details: the veteran's tool bag, his calm demeanor, the way he had known exactly where to look on the C-130. There was something more to this man than just a mechanic or a groundskeeper. Stevens had to know who he was. The next morning, Stevens decided to take matters into his own hands. He visited the base's archives, hoping to find some kind of record or clue about the veteran. It was a long shot, but he figured it was worth a try. After hours of digging through old records and maintenance logs, Stevens found something. Hidden deep in the archives was a report from a few years ago, detailing a special assignment involving a retired veteran who had been called in to help with a critical repair on a military aircraft. The name on the report was familiar: Martin Kelly. Stevens' heart skipped a beat. He quickly pulled up more files, cross-referencing the name. The more he dug, the clearer it became. Martin Kelly wasn't just any veteran. He was a decorated war hero, a man who had served in multiple conflicts and had earned numerous commendations. Stevens couldn't believe what he was reading. The quiet veteran wasn't just some random civilian. He was a living legend. The realization hit Stevens like a ton of bricks. This man, Martin Kelly, had been part of some of the most critical operations in military history. And here he was, standing on the flight line, fixing a plane with the kind of skill and precision that only someone with years of experience could possess. Stevens couldn't help but feel a deep sense of awe. He had been in the presence of a true hero, and he hadn't even realized it. That night, as Stevens sat at his desk, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had discovered. He had spent the past few days looking for answers, and now he had them. But the more he learned about Martin Kelly, the more questions he had. Why had he come to the base? Why had he chosen to remain anonymous? And what was his connection to the C-130? Stevens knew he had to find Kelly. He couldn't let this mystery go unsolved. He had to meet the man who had fixed the plane, the man who had somehow become both a ghost and a legend in his own right. The next morning, Stevens set out to find Martin Kelly. He wasn't sure where to start, but he knew one thing for sure. Kelly wasn't someone you could just forget. He had a legacy, and Stevens was determined to uncover it. As Stevens walked through the base, his mind raced with possibilities. Where could he find Kelly? And more importantly, what would he learn when he did? Stevens spent the next few days trying to track down Martin Kelly. He had a name now, and he was determined to find the man who had saved the C-130. Every time Stevens asked around, he was met with vague responses or a hurried change of subject. It was as though people knew more than they were letting on, but nobody wanted to say anything. He even went to the maintenance office again, hoping someone might have more information, but each time, he was met with a wall of silence. Then one afternoon, Stevens overheard something at the mess hall that changed everything. He was sitting with Hayes when he overheard a conversation at the next table. Two senior officers were talking, and Stevens caught the name Kelly. His heart skipped a beat. He leaned in slightly, trying to hear more. "They say he's coming back tomorrow," one officer said. The other officer nodded, a slight frown on his face. "I don't know why. He's back. It's been years. He's supposed to be retired, off the grid." Stevens didn't know what to think. Why was Martin Kelly back? What was his connection to the base? He had to find out more. After a few minutes of eavesdropping, Stevens made his decision. He had to confront Kelly. He couldn't let this mystery go on any longer. He went to the base's command post and waited. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. Just as Stevens was about to give up and go home, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Stevens' heart raced as the vehicle came to a stop. The door opened, and out stepped Martin Kelly. The old veteran walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the area as if he knew exactly where he was going. Stevens stood frozen for a moment before finally gathering the courage to approach him. "Excuse me, Mr. Kelly?" Stevens called out, his voice a little shaky. Kelly stopped in his tracks and turned slowly. His eyes, though weathered and tired, held a calm, steady gaze. He didn't say anything at first, just studied Stevens for a moment. "You're the one who fixed the C-130, Stevens said, trying to keep his voice steady. Kelly nodded slightly, but didn't speak. Stevens hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I've been looking for you. I need to know how you did it. The plane was dead. We couldn't figure out what was wrong, but you just came in and fixed it. How did you know?" Kelly's face remained impassive. For a moment, Stevens thought he wasn't going to respond, but then Kelly's voice, low and measured, finally broke the silence. "It's not always about what's on the diagnostic screen or the manuals," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's about knowing the machine, understanding it in a way that can't be measured by new technology." Stevens was stunned. There was a depth to Kelly's words, a wisdom that only came with years of experience. "What do you mean?" Stevens asked, his curiosity piqued. Kelly looked out across the base, his gaze distant for a moment, as if he was seeing something far beyond the concrete and tarmac. "I spent years working on machines, saving people's lives, fixing things in places that didn't have the luxury of fancy tools or diagnostic software," Kelly explained. "Out there, in the field, you don't have time to worry about what the computers say. You learn to trust your instincts." Stevens was silent, processing Kelly's words. "But you didn't just fix it by instinct," Stevens said finally. "You knew exactly where to look. You pinpointed the problem in minutes." Kelly's expression softened slightly, but he didn't answer right away. "Sometimes, when you've been around long enough, you just know," he said. "Machines speak to you. They have a rhythm, a pattern. You just have to listen." Stevens felt a sense of awe wash over him. He had been working on planes for years, but the confidence and skill Kelly exhibited went beyond anything he had ever experienced. "Why did you come back?" Stevens asked, his voice quieter now. Kelly looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "I never really left," he said. "You can't run away from your past. I came back because there's still work to be done. This place, it's where I belong." Stevens didn't fully understand, but he didn't press him any further. The man in front of him wasn't just a mechanic or a veteran. He was something more, something that couldn't be quantified by a resume or a set of credentials. "I'm not here for recognition," Kelly continued, his voice steady. "I don't need anyone's thanks. I just do what I can." Stevens nodded, his respect for Kelly growing with every word. "But you deserve recognition," Stevens said. "People need to know what you've done, what you've given." Kelly shook his head. "Not my style. I'm here to fix things. That's all that matters." With that, Kelly turned and began walking toward the hangar, his gait steady and purposeful. Stevens stood there for a moment, still trying to process the conversation. He had come to find answers, but what he had uncovered was far more profound than he had ever imagined. Kelly wasn't just a man with a talent for fixing machines. He was a reminder that sometimes the greatest skills are those that aren't measured by technology, but by experience and a deep understanding of the world around you. Stevens followed him for a few steps, then stopped. He realized there was nothing more to say. The quiet veteran had already said it all. The days following his encounter with Martin Kelly were both puzzling and eye-opening for Stevens. He couldn't shake the impression of the quiet veteran. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Kelly wasn't just some old man who had happened to show up. There was something deeper at play here, something Stevens couldn't quite put into words. Kelly had been a mystery the moment he arrived, but now Stevens understood that the answers he sought would take him far beyond just a simple mechanic skill. It wasn't long before Stevens' curiosity got the best of him again. One afternoon, after a long shift, he made his way back to the hangar, hoping to speak with Kelly again. As he approached, he noticed the same black SUV parked outside. Kelly had to be inside. Taking a deep breath, Stevens stepped inside, expecting to find the hangar quiet. But to his surprise, Kelly was sitting at a workbench, his hands busy with tools, focused entirely on the task in front of him. The air was thick with the smell of grease and metal, the hum of the overhead lights adding to the peaceful atmosphere. Stevens hesitated for a moment before walking over. "Mr. Kelly," Stevens began. Kelly didn't look up at first. He simply continued working, his hands moving with practiced precision. "What can I do for you, Stevens?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. Stevens wasn't sure where to start. "I've been thinking about what you said, about trusting the machines and listening to them. I don't know, but something about that stuck with me," Stevens admitted. Kelly finally looked up, his eyes steady and unflinching. "It's all about respect," he said quietly. "Machines, people, situations. You have to know them well enough to trust them. But it's more than just knowing how they work. It's understanding what they need." Stevens nodded slowly, his mind racing with the possibilities. "You've been through a lot, haven't you? More than just fixing planes, I mean." Kelly's expression remained unchanged, but there was a brief flicker of something in his eyes. A memory, perhaps. "More than you can imagine," Kelly replied softly. Stevens could sense the weight of the words, but he didn't push. Instead, he asked, "What made you come back? Why are you here now, after all this time?" Kelly let out a sigh, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You don't ever really leave," he said. "You can walk away from the uniform, from the front lines, but there's always something that calls you back. Some things you just don't walk away from." Stevens wasn't sure if Kelly was speaking about the military, the planes, or something deeper, but he knew better than to ask. Kelly had said just enough. There was a certain finality in his words, a wisdom that Stevens couldn't quite comprehend, but one he hoped to understand someday. As Stevens stood there, he realized just how much he still had to learn, not just about aircraft, but about life, about duty, and about the quiet strength that came from experience. It wasn't long before Stevens had another chance to observe Kelly's skill. A few days later, the base's maintenance crew was called to assist with a routine inspection of another aircraft, a large transport helicopter. The crew had run into some issues with the helicopter's rotor system, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary on the surface. Kelly, as usual, was quiet, watching the team with a critical eye. "What do you see?" Stevens asked him, hoping for another bit of wisdom. Kelly didn't answer immediately. He simply walked over to the helicopter and crouched down near the rotor assembly. The rest of the team continued their inspection, but Stevens noticed how Kelly's eyes never left the helicopter, as if he was studying the very core of it. "It's the bearings," Kelly finally said, his voice low. "They're out of alignment." Stevens blinked, surprised. "But everything checks out on the diagnostics," he said. Kelly didn't respond, just motioned for Stevens to follow him. Together, they climbed up into the cockpit, and Kelly pointed to a specific spot. "Right here," he said. "You won't find it on the system. It's too small for that. But it's enough to cause issues." Stevens, following Kelly's direction, found a slight wear on one of the rotor's bearings, something no one had noticed before. The rest of the team stared in disbelief as Stevens quickly relayed the findings to the lead technician, who confirmed the problem. "How did you know that?" Stevens asked Kelly, stunned. Kelly simply smiled, but there was no pride in it, no hint of ego. "I've seen it before," he said. "In places where the machines don't get the luxury of a diagnostic system. You have to listen to them, feel for them." Stevens stood there, speechless. He had been trained to rely on technology, on the latest systems and tools, but Kelly had shown him a different way, a way to trust not just the machines, but his own instincts. The helicopter was fixed in record time, and the team stood in awe, realizing just how much they had learned from the quiet veteran. But Kelly didn't stay for the praise. He simply nodded at Stevens, then turned to leave. Keep listening, Kelly said over his shoulder as he walked away. That's how you get better. Stevens watched him disappear into the distance, feeling a sense of respect and gratitude that ran deeper than words. Kelly had taught him more than any manual, any tool, or any piece of technology ever could. And Stevens knew he would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his career. Stevens had learned more in the past few weeks than he ever thought possible. He had watched Martin Kelly fix machines, guide the team with quiet authority, and demonstrated deep, almost unshakable understanding of what it meant to work with military equipment. But there was one thing Stevens hadn't quite figured out yet: why Kelly had returned to the base in the first place. The more Stevens observed him, the more he realized that Kelly wasn't just here to fix machines. There was something deeper, a purpose beyond what met the eye. One evening, Stevens decided to get some answers. After a long day at the hangar, he found Kelly sitting alone at the bench, once again lost in his thoughts. The old veteran was cleaning his tools, methodically going over each one as if it were a ritual. Stevens walked up quietly, hesitated for a moment, and then spoke. "Mr. Kelly, I've been meaning to ask you something," he began. Kelly looked up slowly, his eyes still calm, but now focused on Stevens. "What is it?" Kelly replied. "I've been wondering," Stevens continued, his voice a bit unsure. "Why did you come back? I mean, you're retired, you've earned your rest. Why come back to this place, to the base, and get involved again?" Kelly's eyes softened as he put down his tools and leaned back in his chair. He didn't answer immediately, as though contemplating the question in the silence. "You're right, Stevens," Kelly said at last, his voice steady but filled with a hint of something deeper. "I could have stayed away. I could have lived out my days on the coast, fishing or doing whatever old men do when they're done. But that's not how it works. It's not just about retiring. Some of us don't know how to stop." Stevens felt a wave of understanding wash over him. Kelly wasn't just talking about working on planes. He was talking about purpose. "You miss it, don't you?" Stevens said softly. Kelly nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the far end of the hangar where the aircraft lined up. "It's not just the work," Kelly said, his voice quieter now. "It's the people, the camaraderie, the feeling that you're part of something bigger than yourself. That's what keeps you going. When you've seen what I've seen, been through what I've been through, you realize that what matters isn't just fixing machines. It's keeping that bond alive, passing on the knowledge, sharing what you've learned." Stevens took a moment to digest what Kelly was saying. It wasn't just about aircraft or mechanical skills. It was about the shared experience of service, of sacrifice, and of being part of something larger. "So what happens now?" Stevens asked. Kelly looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Now," Kelly repeated, as though considering it. "Now, I keep helping out. Keep doing what I can. Because there's always something that needs fixing. And there are always people who need to learn." Stevens nodded, more deeply moved than he had been in a long time. He understood now that Kelly's return wasn't about seeking recognition or even fixing machines. It was about sharing his knowledge with the next generation. It was about teaching the younger airmen what it meant to be part of something that mattered. Over the next few weeks, Stevens began to see Kelly's influence spread throughout the base. He would show up at the hangar, not with an agenda, but with a purpose: to help. He mentored the young engineers, showing them techniques that hadn't made it into the textbooks. His lessons weren't just about machines, they were about character. Kelly emphasized the importance of patience, of careful attention to detail, and of working as a team. "It's never just one person," Kelly would say. "You need to work together. A machine is only as strong as the people who work on it." Stevens watched as Kelly's quiet wisdom began to resonate with everyone who worked with him. They all saw the value of his experience, his calm, unassuming demeanor. It wasn't just about the tools or the technology. It was about the heart and the hands that used them. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning to set, Stevens walked through the hangar, watching the team work. The C-130, the very plane that had been fixed by Kelly all those days ago, was being prepped for another flight. Stevens stood off to the side, taking it all in. Kelly walked over and stood next to him, watching the plane as well. "You know," Kelly said quietly, "this plane's been through a lot. She's not just a machine, she's a part of something bigger. The men and women who work on her, the crew who fly her, they're all connected. They all have a story to tell." Stevens nodded. "I'm starting to understand that," he said. It's not just about getting the job done. It's about who you're doing it for. Kelly smiled faintly, a rare moment of warmth crossing his face. Exactly, he said. Now you're getting it. Stevens had learned more than just mechanics from Martin Kelly. He had learned the value of teamwork, of shared experiences, and of passing down knowledge. As the base prepared for the next mission, Stevens knew that Kelly's influence would live on long after the veteran had moved on. He had not only fixed planes, he had fixed the spirit of the base, the pride in the work, and the bond between those who served. As Kelly walked away that day, Stevens watched him disappear into the distance, knowing that he had just witnessed something truly remarkable. Kelly had come back not for himself, but for the next generation. He had come back to teach them what it meant to be a part of something bigger than themselves. Weeks passed, and Stevens continued to learn from Martin Kelly. The quiet veteran's presence became a steady source of wisdom and guidance for everyone around him. It wasn't just about fixing planes anymore. It was about building something deeper, a legacy. Stevens could see it now. Kelly wasn't just teaching them mechanical skills, but life lessons, instilling values that would stay with them long after the work was done. One afternoon, as Stevens walked into the hangar, he noticed Kelly standing by the massive engine of a C-130, his hands resting on the metal surface, his gaze distant, almost lost in thought. The veteran looked up when Stevens approached, his eyes sharp and clear as always. "You ever stop and just think about the weight of it all?" Kelly asked, his voice low. Stevens didn't quite understand at first. "What do you mean?" he asked, stepping closer. Kelly motioned toward the C-130. "This isn't just a machine. This is a lifeline. This is how people get home, how supplies get delivered. Every time this engine roars to life, it's a promise. A promise that it'll get where it's going, no matter what. And people trust it. That's a heavy thing to carry." Stevens nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "So it's not just about the job?" he asked. "Exactly," Kelly replied. "It's never just about the job. It's about what the job represents. The bigger picture." Stevens stood in silence for a moment, reflecting on Kelly's words. He had always thought of the work as just a task to be completed, but now he saw it in a different light. Each aircraft, each repair, wasn't just a job. It was a piece of a much larger mission. Later that evening, Stevens found himself sitting in the break room, his mind still on Kelly's words. He hadn't been able to shake the idea of carrying something so important, something that wasn't just about personal success, but about the greater good. He found himself feeling a deep sense of respect for Kelly, not just as a mechanic, but as someone who had truly lived the values of service and sacrifice. That respect grew deeper the next morning when Stevens arrived early at the hangar to find Kelly already at work. The old veteran was once again tinkering with tools, carefully inspecting a set of parts for a Chinook helicopter. He looked up as Stevens walked in, his expression unchanged but somehow knowing. "Got a lot on your mind, Stevens?" Kelly asked, his tone casual. Stevens paused for a moment before answering. "I was thinking about what you said yesterday. About the weight of it all. About the bigger picture. I don't think I really understood that until now." Kelly nodded, his eyes softening. "Takes some time, doesn't it? Most people think it's all about the mechanics, the machines. But it's never just that. If you're lucky, you figure out the rest of it along the way." Stevens watched Kelly for a moment, noticing the ease with which the man worked. There was something incredibly calming about him, as if his years of experience had given him a peace that no amount of chaos could shake. "I want to learn more," Stevens said, the words coming out without thinking. "I want to learn everything. Not just about the machines, but about how you do what you do." Kelly raised an eyebrow, then smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "You're asking the right questions, Stevens. That's the first step. Keep asking. Keep listening." Stevens smiled back, a feeling of determination welling up inside him. He knew that he still had a lot to learn, but for the first time, he felt ready for it. As the days passed, Stevens found himself more and more focused on the bigger picture that Kelly had talked about. It wasn't just about fixing machines. It was about understanding how those machines fit into the world around them. It was about the people who relied on them. It was about the missions they supported and the lives they affected. One day, a week later, the base received a surprise inspection from a senior officer, a colonel who had flown in to assess the state of the aircraft and the readiness of the crew. The entire team was on edge, knowing that a poor inspection could delay future flights. Stevens, more than anyone, felt the pressure. He knew that Kelly would likely be the one to speak up, to take charge, and guide them through whatever came. But as the colonel walked into the hangar, he stopped, surprised. "What's going on here?" the colonel asked, looking at Stevens and the others. Stevens, trying to steady his nerves, stepped forward. "We're just finishing up a routine inspection on the C-130, sir," he said, his voice steady. Kelly stood to the side, his presence almost invisible, but Stevens could feel the quiet strength of the man's experience. The colonel nodded, inspecting the aircraft before turning to Stevens. "You're the lead on this one, son?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Yes, sir," Stevens answered. The colonel eyed him for a moment, then looked back at Kelly. "What about him?" "He's the one who fixed the C-130 a few weeks ago, sir," Stevens replied. "He's been guiding the team since then." The colonel raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Instead, he turned back to the aircraft, inspecting it more closely. He walked around, checking every detail, scrutinizing every corner, until finally, he stopped. "Looks good," the colonel said, nodding. "You've all done a fine job." The team stood in stunned silence. It wasn't just the approval that mattered. It was the fact that Stevens had led the team through it. He had done it with Kelly's guidance, but in the end, it was his responsibility. And that feeling of having come through something challenging was like nothing Stevens had ever experienced. As the colonel left, Kelly gave Stevens a quick nod of approval, as if he had seen this moment coming all along. "You did well," Kelly said quietly. Stevens felt a deep sense of pride wash over him. He knew that he was still learning, but now, with Kelly's example guiding him, he felt more confident than ever that he was on the right path. The quiet veteran had shown him the way, not just in how to fix machines, but in how to approach life and duty with honor and integrity. And for the first time, Stevens understood that the weight of it all was something he was ready to carry. The weeks that followed the colonel's inspection were a blur of activity. Stevens found himself more involved than ever, taking on more responsibilities, managing teams, and learning from Kelly every day. The lessons that had seemed small at first, details about machines, about life, about work ethic, had built into a much larger understanding of what it meant to be part of something greater than oneself. Kelly's quiet presence had continued to be a steady influence, but Stevens was beginning to find his own footing. His confidence grew, his skills sharpened, and more importantly, his understanding of leadership began to solidify. One day, as Stevens and Kelly were working on a complicated engine calibration for a Chinook helicopter, the same airman, Jackson, who had previously been skeptical of Kelly, walked up to them, a bit nervous but determined. "Hey, Stevens, can I ask you something?" Jackson said, his voice unsure. Stevens looked up from the engine and nodded. "Sure, what's up?" Jackson hesitated, then pointed toward Kelly. "I've been thinking about what you said about him, about the way he fixes things and the way he knows what's wrong without using all the tech." Stevens glanced over at Kelly, who was working quietly as usual, then back at Jackson. "What about it?" "I don't know," Jackson said, scratching his head. "I mean, I've been trying to get better at this stuff, but sometimes it feels like I'm missing something. I can't always find the problem, even when the tech says there's nothing wrong. And Kelly, he just knows." "How?" Stevens thought for a moment, then smiled. "It's not magic," he said. "It's experience. Kelly's been doing this for years, and he's learned how to read the machine, how to listen to it. You've got to learn to trust your instincts too." Jackson nodded slowly, clearly processing what Stevens was saying. "Yeah, I get it. It's just, I don't think I'm there yet." Stevens clapped him on the shoulder. "You will be. We all start somewhere." Jackson smiled, a bit relieved, and walked off to join the others. Stevens looked over at Kelly, who had continued working without a word. "He's getting there," Stevens said, more to himself than to Kelly. Kelly looked up briefly, giving a slight nod. "Everyone's got their pace," he replied, his voice as steady as always. Later that week, the base received a new assignment. A heavy transport mission required a fleet of aircraft, including C-130s, to deliver supplies to a forward operating base in a remote area. The mission was critical, and it would be one of the most complex operations they had handled in months. Stevens was tasked with overseeing the team preparing the planes for takeoff, and Kelly's guidance was, as always, invaluable. As Stevens and the team worked tirelessly to ensure everything was in order, Kelly appeared at the hangar, standing quietly in the corner, watching the team move. It wasn't long before he walked over to Stevens. You've got this under control? Kelly asked, his tone light, but filled with an underlying seriousness. Stevens looked up at him, feeling the weight of the task ahead. I think so, he said, trying to sound confident. It's a big mission, though. A lot of moving parts. Kelly nodded. The bigger the mission, the more attention to detail you need. Don't let the pressure get to you. Keep your focus. Stevens took a deep breath, feeling the stress of the situation, but Kelly's calm demeanor seemed to settle his nerves. I won't let it get to me, Stevens said. He turned back to the team, issuing instructions and double-checking every part of the plane. Kelly stood back, watching, never intervening unless absolutely necessary. As the hours passed, the final checks were made, and the aircraft were ready to go. The entire base seemed to hold its breath as the planes lined up for takeoff. Stevens, now feeling the weight of the responsibility, took his place at the head of the crew. He gave a final glance at Kelly, who offered a small, approving nod. You've earned this, Kelly said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. Stevens smiled, his chest swelling with pride. It wasn't just the mission that mattered. It was the journey that had brought him here, the lessons he had learned along the way. As the planes began to take off, one by one, Stevens felt a sense of accomplishment settle over him. He had come a long way from the unsure, hesitant airman he had been when Kelly first showed up at the base. The mission went smoothly, and the supplies were delivered on time. It was a victory for the entire team, and Stevens knew that without Kelly's guidance, it might have been different. The quiet veteran had not only taught him how to fix machines, he had taught him how to lead, how to trust his instincts, and how to carry the weight of responsibility with grace. As the final plane landed and the mission was declared a success, Stevens stood with Kelly by the hangar, watching the crew celebrate. You did good, Stevens, Kelly said, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. Stevens smiled, looking at Kelly. We did good, Mr. Kelly, he replied. Kelly chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming with a hint of pride. You're starting to get it, he said, giving Stevens one last nod before turning to leave. Stevens watched him go, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He knew that the lessons Kelly had taught him would stay with him for the rest of his career. It wasn't just about fixing machines. It was about understanding the bigger picture, about being part of something that mattered. And now, Stevens was ready to carry that legacy forward, just as Kelly had. As the weeks passed, Stevens felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier, but so did his confidence. The base had come to rely on him more and more. His leadership was tested daily, and he knew that Kelly's quiet influence was a huge part of that. The veteran's lessons had shaped him into someone capable, someone who could stand at the helm during the most challenging missions. Yet, Stevens knew there was still so much to learn. One evening, after a particularly long day spent in the hangar preparing a new fleet of aircraft, Stevens found himself alone in the break room, sipping a cup of coffee. His thoughts wandered back to Kelly, as they often did. The veteran had been more than just a mentor. He had become a guiding presence in Stevens' life. But there was one thing Stevens hadn't quite figured out yet. What drove Kelly to give so much of himself to others? Kelly had taught him how to fix planes, how to trust his instincts, and how to lead with quiet strength. But Stevens needed to know why Kelly had returned to the base after so many years of service. He needed to understand what had driven Kelly to come back, to take up the mantle of teaching once more. The door to the break room creaked open, and Stevens looked up to see Kelly standing in the doorway. He had a look in his eyes, one that Stevens recognized all too well. It was the same look Kelly had whenever something important was about to happen. Got a minute? Kelly asked, his voice calm, but with a note of urgency. Stevens nodded, setting his coffee cup down on the table. Of course. What's up? Kelly stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. For a moment, they stood in silence. Stevens could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air, as if Kelly were waiting for him to ask the right question. Finally, Stevens broke the silence. Why did you come back? The question felt like it had been building inside him for weeks. Kelly's expression softened slightly, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he walked over to a chair and sat down, his hands resting on his knees. You ever wonder what happens after it's all over? Kelly asked, his voice low. Stevens wasn't sure what Kelly meant at first. After what's over? He asked. Kelly looked at him, his eyes distant. After you've done your time. After you've served. When it's all said and done. When you've retired and there's nothing left but the quiet. Stevens nodded slowly. I guess I haven't really thought about it that much, he admitted. But I imagine it's tough, especially after all the things you've done. Kelly's eyes hardened for a moment, as if he were reliving something in his mind. It is, he said quietly. You think when you retire, you'll have peace. But peace isn't always what you expect. It's lonely. And after all those years of serving, of being part of something bigger, it's hard to just walk away from it. Stevens listened carefully, feeling a deep sense of respect for Kelly's words. He had always admired Kelly's calm demeanor, but now, hearing him speak like this, Stevens realized just how much more there was to the man. So you came back because of that? Stevens asked, his voice almost a whisper. Kelly didn't immediately answer. Instead, he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the tarmac where the planes were lined up. I came back because I still have something to give, Kelly said, his voice heavy with emotion. I came back because, even though I'm retired, there's still more to teach, more to share. I didn't come back for me. I came back for the next generation. Stevens stood up and walked over to join him by the window. He looked out at the planes, the very machines that had brought them together. I understand, Stevens said quietly. You're not just fixing machines. You're passing on something that can't be measured in tools or manuals. Kelly looked at him, his expression softening. Exactly, he said. It's not just about the work. It's about the people you work with. It's about showing them the way. There's a certain kind of responsibility that comes with experience. You don't walk away from that. Stevens felt a deep sense of understanding settle over him. He had learned so much from Kelly, not just about fixing planes, but about the meaning of service, of duty, and of passing on knowledge to others. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his career. But there was something more in Kelly's words. It wasn't just about teaching, it was about leaving a legacy. So what happens now? Stevens asked, still processing everything Kelly had shared. Kelly turned to face him, his eyes steady. Now we keep going, he said. There will always be more work to do. But it's about the people who come after us. We make sure they're ready. Stevens nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility. Kelly's legacy wasn't just about what he had done. It was about what he was doing now, about ensuring the next generation of airmen was ready to take on the challenges ahead. As Stevens stood there, with Kelly by his side, he knew that the quiet veteran had already given him more than he could have ever imagined. And it wasn't just about the aircraft or the tools. It was about the lives they touched, the lessons they shared, and the legacy they left behind. That, Stevens realized, was the true power of service. The days following their conversation were marked by an unspoken shift. Stevens could feel the weight of Kelly's words, of the responsibility he now carried, settling into his bones. It wasn't just about leading the team or maintaining the aircraft. It was about something deeper. It was about what they were doing here and what they were leaving behind. The mission at hand was one of the biggest in recent memory. A series of high-priority airlifts had been scheduled, and it would require flawless execution from the entire team. Tensions were high as the planes were prepped for takeoff. The atmosphere in the hangar was electric, each person focused on the task at hand. Stevens felt the pressure mounting, but he also felt ready. He had grown under Kelly's quiet mentorship, learning the deeper meaning behind each action, each repair, each step forward. As the day wore on, Stevens worked alongside his team, checking the planes, ensuring everything was in perfect condition. Kelly, as always, was nearby, moving through the hangar like a shadow. He didn't speak much, but Stevens could feel the veteran's watchful presence guiding him. When the time came for the planes to begin their takeoff, Stevens stood at the edge of the tarmac, overseeing the operation. The engines roared to life one by one, and the heavy cargo planes began to roll forward. It was a sight to behold, the culmination of days of preparation, of countless hours spent working side by side with the team. As the final plane began its takeoff, Stevens took a moment to look at Kelly, standing off to the side, his expression as calm as ever. "We're doing it," Stevens said, his voice filled with quiet pride. Kelly looked over at him, offering a small smile. "You're doing it," he replied. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Stevens didn't fully comprehend until that moment. It wasn't just about the mechanics, the repairs, or the planes. It was about the people who were part of the mission, who were willing to give everything to ensure its success. As the planes ascended into the sky, Stevens watched them for a long moment, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. They had done it. The team had pulled together, had worked as one, and they had completed the mission flawlessly. It was a victory that went beyond the technical. It was a victory of spirit, of leadership, and of unity. Later that evening, as the team celebrated their success, Stevens found himself standing by the hangar, alone with his thoughts. He was still processing everything that had happened, how far he had come, how much he had learned, and how much more there was to understand. He turned to see Kelly walking toward him, his steady steps unhurried. "You did well today," Kelly said, his voice as calm and steady as always. Stevens nodded, feeling the weight of the compliment. "We did well," he corrected. Kelly raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "That's the right answer," he said, his voice softening. "It's not about one person, Stevens. It never is. It's about the whole team." Stevens smiled. "I get that now," he said quietly. Kelly didn't say anything more. Instead, he simply stood there with Stevens, both of them watching as the last of the planes disappeared into the night sky. For the first time, Stevens understood what Kelly meant. It wasn't about one person standing out. It was about the collective effort, the unity of the group, and the shared sense of purpose. The mission was a success, not because of one individual, but because of everyone who had worked together to make it happen. As Stevens stood there in the cool evening air, he knew that he was no longer the uncertain airman he had once been. He had grown into something more. He had learned what it truly meant to lead, to work with others, and to serve a purpose greater than himself. And as Kelly turned to walk away, Stevens felt a sense of gratitude settle over him. The quiet veteran had shown him what it meant to be part of something bigger, to give everything for the greater good, and to never forget the importance of the team. "Thanks," Stevens said to Kelly's back, though the veteran didn't turn around. Kelly didn't need to respond. Stevens knew the lesson had already been taught. And as he watched Kelly disappear into the shadows of the hangar, Stevens felt ready for whatever the future held. He knew that, no matter what came next, he was prepared. He had the tools, the knowledge, and, most importantly, the understanding of what it meant to be part of something that mattered. It had been several months since Stevens had fully embraced the lessons Kelly had imparted. The hangar had become a place of growth for him, a space where his leadership was tested daily, not just in managing the aircraft, but in guiding the newer crew members, many of whom looked to him for answers. It wasn't easy, but it was something Stevens had come to find rewarding in a way he had never expected. Kelly, on the other hand, had taken a quieter role. He still checked in, still offered guidance when it was needed, but his presence had shifted. Stevens began to realize that Kelly wasn't just teaching him how to lead the team. He was teaching him how to step into the future, how to trust the next generation to take up the mantle. One morning, as Stevens was reviewing the pre-flight checklist for a group of C-130s, he noticed Kelly standing off to the side, his hands resting on his tool belt, watching the crew work. Stevens had gotten used to Kelly's quiet observations, but today there was something different in the way Kelly was looking at him. "Something on your mind?" Stevens asked, stepping over to where Kelly stood. Kelly gave him a small smile, though there was a hint of something deeper in his eyes. "Just watching you," he said quietly. "You've come a long way, Stevens." Stevens didn't know how to respond to that. "I've had a lot of help," he said, glancing at the other crew members who were working nearby. Kelly chuckled softly. "You've got it in you. You always have." Stevens felt a slight discomfort at the compliment, not because it wasn't true, but because he knew he hadn't come this far alone. There was a part of him that still felt like he was riding on Kelly's coattails, still living in the shadow of the quiet veteran who had shaped him so deeply. "It's not just me," Stevens said, his voice firm. "It's the team. We're all in this together." Kelly nodded, his gaze flickering toward the team. "Exactly. And you're learning that. You've learned to trust them." Stevens smiled and looked around the hangar, where his team worked in a seamless rhythm. It was true. They were a unit, and he had learned the value of relying on others, just as Kelly had taught him. Just as he was about to turn back to the C-130, one of the younger airmen, Harris, approached, holding a maintenance log. "Lieutenant Stevens," Harris began, "we've run into an issue with the fuel system on this C-130. The diagnostics aren't showing anything, but it's definitely having trouble starting." Stevens took the log from Harris, scanning it quickly. "All right, let's check it out," Stevens said, heading for the aircraft. As they approached, Stevens motioned for the crew to start going through the checklist, checking connections and fuel lines. All right, let's troubleshoot this one step at a time, Stevens said, taking charge. He could feel the weight of the responsibility, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. He knew what he was doing, and more importantly, he knew how to lead the team through it. As the crew worked together to isolate the issue, Stevens couldn't help but feel the quiet pride of seeing the lessons Kelly had taught him come to life. Kelly was standing a few feet away, watching the process, but not intervening. For a moment, Stevens considered asking for Kelly's insight, but then he realized something important. He didn't need to ask. He had learned enough that he could trust his own instincts now. After some time, the issue was found, a small blockage in the fuel filter that had slipped under the radar of the diagnostic system. It wasn't a huge problem, but it was enough to keep the engine from starting properly. Good work, everyone, Stevens said, as the crew finished the fix. Harris, who had been a bit tentative in the beginning, now stood tall, his pride evident. Thanks, Lieutenant, he said, a grin crossing his face. I think I'm starting to get the hang of this. Stevens returned the smile, nodding. We're all learning, Harris. One step at a time. As the plane's engines roared to life, Stevens stepped back and took a breath. He looked over at Kelly, who gave him a small nod of approval. The veteran didn't need to say anything. Stevens could read the approval in the small gesture. The team had done it. They had solved the problem, just as they always had. As the aircraft took off, Stevens watched it disappear into the sky, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about fixing planes anymore. It was about fixing what needed to be fixed in themselves, in the team, in the people they relied on. Later that day, as Stevens walked to his office, Kelly caught up with him. How are you feeling? Kelly asked. I'm good, Stevens said, glancing at the veteran. I think we're all good. Kelly smiled, a rare, full smile that softened his features. You've got it now, he said. You've learned how to trust your team. And when you trust them, they'll trust you. Stevens nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude. Thanks, Mr. Kelly. I wouldn't have gotten here without you. Kelly looked at him thoughtfully for a moment. You've always had it in you, Stevens. I just helped you see it. Stevens knew it was true. He had always had it in him. He just needed someone to show him how to unlock it. And now, as he watched Kelly walk off into the hangar, he felt ready for whatever challenges came next. Because with the lessons he had learned, and the team he had built, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The weeks following the successful mission were filled with routine work, but for Stevens, there was always something lingering in the back of his mind. He had learned so much, not just about aircraft, but about leadership, responsibility, and trust. The crew was more unified than ever, and Stevens had found himself stepping into the role of mentor, just as Kelly had once mentored him. He could feel Kelly's influence in everything he did, every decision, every interaction with the team, and every repair on the planes. But despite his growth, Stevens still felt like there was one more lesson to learn, one final step he needed to take to truly understand what it meant to lead. One afternoon, Stevens found himself alone in the hangar, walking past rows of planes that were being prepped for their next mission. He had just finished a routine inspection and was going over the day's checklist when he noticed Kelly standing off to the side, watching him. The old veteran hadn't said much lately, but Stevens could tell he was still keeping an eye on him. You've been doing a good job, Kelly said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of approval. Stevens smiled, but the words didn't feel like enough. He was ready for the next challenge, but he wasn't sure what that challenge was yet. I'm just trying to keep things running smoothly, Stevens replied. Kelly's gaze never wavered as he took a step closer. It's not just about running things smoothly, Stevens. It's about what happens when things don't go according to plan. Stevens looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Kelly nodded toward a group of airmen working on a nearby plane. When the unexpected happens, when the problems aren't so obvious, that's when you'll see what kind of leader you really are. It's easy to lead when everything's working well. But when things break down, that's when you have to step up. Stevens listened carefully, the weight of Kelly's words sinking in. He had always prided himself on being able to handle routine situations, but Kelly was right. He had never truly been tested under pressure. I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of pressure, Stevens admitted. Kelly smiled, a rare, knowing smile. None of us are ready, Stevens. You just have to trust yourself when the time comes. The conversation lingered in Stevens' mind over the next few days. He wasn't sure what kind of test Kelly was talking about, but he could feel the sense of anticipation growing. It wasn't long before the test came, in the form of an emergency. A critical mission had been scheduled to deliver supplies to a remote military outpost. The aircraft had been prepped, and the crew was ready to go. But just as they were about to take off, an issue with one of the engines was detected. It wasn't a major problem, but it was enough to ground the plane until it was fixed. The clock was ticking, and the mission had to go out on time. Stevens was thrust into the role of making the decision. The team was looking to him for answers, and he could feel the weight of their expectations. The engine problem was subtle, nothing that showed up on the diagnostic equipment, but Stevens knew the stakes. "We need to figure this out, fast," Stevens said, his voice firm but calm. He looked around at his team, his crew. "We've got this. Let's break it down and find the issue." He had barely finished speaking when Kelly stepped forward, his quiet confidence unmistakable. "I'll go with you," Kelly said. "We'll check it together." Stevens nodded, grateful for Kelly's support. As they made their way to the plane, Stevens realized how much he had come to rely on Kelly's calm presence. Kelly didn't rush, didn't panic. He simply got to work, helping Stevens go over the engine with a fine-tooth comb. The rest of the crew worked diligently alongside them, but it was clear that Stevens had taken charge, guiding them through each step. As they inspected the engine, Stevens felt a growing sense of certainty. He was ready for this. He could handle the pressure. They found the issue, a small but critical malfunction in the fuel system that wasn't detectable by the diagnostic tools. With Kelly's help, Stevens and the crew were able to fix the problem and get the plane back in the air in record time. The mission was a success. As Stevens watched the plane take off, he felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had faced a real challenge, and he had led his team through it. Later that evening, as the team celebrated their success, Stevens found himself standing outside the hangar, watching the sunset. Kelly approached him silently, standing next to him in the fading light. "You did well today," Kelly said, his voice as calm as ever. Stevens turned to him, feeling a sense of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," Stevens replied. Kelly smiled slightly, the ghost of a proud expression crossing his face. "You had it in you all along, Stevens. You just had to trust yourself." Stevens nodded, understanding now what Kelly had been trying to teach him. It wasn't about the planes or the repairs, it was about trust. Trusting himself, trusting his team, and knowing that when the pressure was on, he could step up and lead. He had passed the test, and with Kelly's guidance, he had learned the true meaning of leadership. The days that followed the mission were quieter, but they carried a deeper significance for Stevens. He had proven to himself, and to his team, that he could lead. The quiet veteran's lessons had shaped him into someone capable of handling the toughest situations, but Stevens knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always lessons to be learned. But now, he felt ready for whatever came next. One morning, as Stevens walked into the hangar to oversee another routine inspection, he noticed something different. Kelly wasn't there, and for the first time in months, Stevens realized he hadn't seen the old veteran in days. He stopped by the tool bench, where the rest of the crew was working, and asked, "Has anyone seen Kelly?" The airmen looked up, some shrugging, others simply shaking their heads. "I think he's been gone for a few days," Harris, one of the younger crew members, said. Stevens' heart sank a little. Kelly had always been there, offering guidance, checking in, making sure the team was on track. "Is he okay?" Stevens asked, a slight concern creeping into his voice. "He seemed fine the last time we worked together," Harris said. He didn't say anything about leaving. Stevens tried to push away the nagging feeling in his chest. Kelly was a private person, and he had never been one for making a big deal out of anything. Still, Stevens couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. As the day went on, Stevens found himself looking out over the tarmac more than he usually did. His mind wandered, thinking about Kelly and wondering if the quiet veteran had decided to finally step away from the base for good. That evening, as Stevens wrapped up his shift, he decided to take one last walk through the hangar. It was late, the hangar almost empty, save for a few technicians finishing up some minor repairs. As he passed by the office, he saw a familiar figure standing in the doorway. "Kelly." Stevens stopped in his tracks, surprised but relieved to see him. "Mr. Kelly," Stevens called out, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and warmth. Kelly looked up, a small smile forming on his face. "You look like you're in charge these days," Kelly said, his voice as calm as ever. Stevens walked over to him, still processing the sight of the veteran. "Where have you been?" Stevens asked. "I was starting to think you were gone for good." Kelly chuckled softly, the sound filling the quiet hangar. "I didn't go anywhere, Stevens," he said. "I've just been taking a step back, letting you handle things on your own. You've earned it." Stevens looked at him, unsure of what to say. He had grown so used to Kelly being around, offering his quiet wisdom, that the thought of losing him felt strange. "But what about you?" Stevens asked. "Don't you have anything left to teach me?" Kelly's expression softened, his eyes steady as he looked at Stevens. "You've learned everything you need to," he said quietly. "It's time for you to take the lead fully. It's not about me teaching you anymore. It's about you passing it on to the next generation." Stevens absorbed Kelly's words, the weight of them settling in his chest. He had always seen Kelly as a mentor, someone to rely on. But now, for the first time, Stevens realized that Kelly had been preparing him for this moment all along. He had been teaching him how to stand on his own, how to trust himself and his team. "I'm not ready to let you go," Stevens admitted. Kelly smiled gently. "You don't have to let go, Stevens. I'm still here. I'll always be here, in the background, watching. But it's your time now." Stevens felt a rush of emotions, pride, gratitude, but also a sense of responsibility. It was as though Kelly had passed the baton to him, not just in leadership, but in continuing the legacy of knowledge and service. "Thank you, Mr. Kelly," Stevens said, his voice thick with appreciation. "I couldn't have done it without you." Kelly nodded, his smile deepening. "You've always had it in you, Stevens. I just helped you see it." With that, Kelly turned and walked toward the exit, his steps as steady as ever. Stevens stood there for a moment, watching the veteran leave, feeling the weight of the responsibility he now carried. But this time, he wasn't afraid of it. He had learned everything he needed to. As Kelly disappeared into the night, Stevens knew that he was ready. Ready to lead, ready to pass on the lessons he had learned, and ready to continue the work that had started long before he had even arrived. The legacy of service, of dedication, of quiet strength. It wasn't just Kelly's anymore. It was his. And as Stevens looked out at the planes lined up on the tarmac, ready for the next mission, he understood that the journey was just beginning. He was no longer the student, he was the teacher now. And with that thought, Stevens felt a surge of purpose unlike anything he had ever felt before. This emotional story follows the journey of a young airman who learns valuable lessons about leadership, responsibility, and teamwork under the guidance of a quiet veteran. As the airman grows into his role, he begins to understand the true meaning of service and the importance of trusting his instincts. The emotional story shows how one person's wisdom and experience can shape the future of others, passing on knowledge that lasts a lifetime. From fixing machines to leading a team under pressure, this emotional story highlights the powerful impact of mentorship and the lessons that are learned through challenges. With moments of triumph and self-discovery, the emotional story proves that leadership isn't just about commanding others. It's about understanding, guiding, and inspiring those who follow. As the young airman steps into the role of mentor himself, the emotional story comes full circle, showing how the past shapes the future. It's a tale of growth, self-realization, and the quiet strength of those who lead by example.